Long before the Portuguese arrived, the coastal lands where Rio de Janeiro now stands were inhabited by the Tupi people. Their villages lined the shores, surrounded by dense Atlantic forests. They fished in the sparkling waters, hunted in the forests, and planted cassava and maize in fertile soils. Life was rich in culture, but also marked by tribal rivalries and ceremonies that shaped their world. In January 1502, an exploratory fleet led by the Portuguese captain Gaspar de Lemos sailed into an impressive natural harbor on the eastern coast of the New World. Mistaking the vast bay for the mouth of a great river, the Portuguese gave it the name Rio de Janeiro, or River of January, marking the month of their arrival. What Lemos and his crew saw was breathtaking. A sprawling body of water surrounded by rugged granite peaks and lush Atlantic forest, teeming with life. Historians suggest that Amerigo Vespucci, the Italian explorer who joined Lemos's expedition, documented the grandeur of the landscape, describing its untouched beauty as paradise-like. Yet this land was far from empty. It was the home of the Tupinamba people, part of the larger Tupi civilization, whose villages dotted the shores of the bay. The Tupinamba, skilled in agriculture and warfare, greeted the Portuguese with both curiosity and caution. The explorers were awestruck by their appearance, their bodies painted with intricate patterns of red and black, and adorned with feathered headdresses and beads. The encounter marked the beginning of a complex relationship between Europeans and indigenous Brazilians, foreshadowing decades of conflict, alliances, and cultural exchange. By the 1530s, the Portuguese crown realized the strategic importance of establishing a permanent presence in Brazil to secure its claim against encroachments by other European powers. The appointment of Martim Afonso de Souza to lead an expedition marked the first significant colonization effort. Sousa's mission was to establish settlements, combat piracy, and expand the sugar trade, which was already flourishing in Pernambuco. However, Guanabara Bay, with its strategic location and abundant resources, was seen as a jewel in Portugal's colonial ambitions. The indigenous Tupinamba fiercely resisted these incursions, defending their land with unparalleled tenacity. Their knowledge of the terrain, coupled with guerrilla tactics, posed a significant challenge to Portuguese forces. The arrival of Jesuit missionaries further complicated the dynamics, as they sought to convert indigenous communities while navigating tensions between colonists and local tribes. By the mid-16th century, France sought to challenge Portugal's dominance in Brazil. French traders and explorers, lured by the wealth of the New World, began establishing footholds along the coast. In 1550, the arrival of French ships in Guanabara Bay signaled a new chapter of conflict. The Tupinamba, weary of Portuguese oppression, forged alliances with the French, hoping to leverage their weapons and resources to push back the colonizers. The French, in turn, promised mutual respect and trade, presenting themselves as liberators rather than conquerors. This alliance set the stage for decades of rivalry and bloodshed. In 1555, a bold French expedition led by Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon sought to establish a colony in the New World, directly challenging Portuguese claims. Arriving in Guanabara Bay, Villegagnon and his men founded the settlement of France Antarctique on a small island in the bay, which they named Fort Coligny. The French colony aimed to create a haven for Huguenots fleeing religious persecution in Europe, but it also served as a strategic foothold in South America. The Portuguese crown acts decisively. Warships laden with soldiers and settlers arrive in Guanabara Bay, their banners flying high. Their mission is clear: to defend the colony and crush French influence. Tensions in the bay escalate as the struggle for dominance takes shape, setting the stage for open conflict. The dense jungle hums with life as Tupinamba warriors prepare to reclaim their land. Guided by French advisors, they attack Portuguese settlements at dawn. Arrows rain down as villagers flee. The clash of cultures erupts into a battle for survival, each side determined to secure their place in the bay's future. The Portuguese respond with ruthless force. Guided by the Crown's directive to protect Brazil at all costs, they march into the jungle, burning Tupinamba villages allied with the French. The smoke of destruction marks their path, leaving a scar on the land and its people. The tide of power begins to shift. Far from Guanabara Bay, the Portuguese crown declares Salvador the capital of Brazil. A strategic move, Salvador becomes the nerve center for colonial administration. While Rio remains vital, the focus shifts, offering a temporary reprieve for the embattled bay. Yet, tensions continue to simmer beneath its tranquil surface. Guanabara Bay glistens under the midday sun. Portuguese settlers rebuild, planting the seeds of permanence. The Tupinamba retreat deeper into the jungle, their resilience undiminished. For now, the bay is calm, but its beauty belies the tension between its past and the uncertain future. The story of Rio de Janeiro is far from over.
Wow, what a fascinating dive into the early days of Rio de Janeiro's history. This segment really brings to life how much of Brazil's early story was shaped by exploration, ambition, and, let's be honest, a fair bit of misunderstanding. Think about it. The Portuguese sail into Guanabara Bay in 1502, and their first act is to name it after something it's not. Rio de Janeiro stuck. But it's a reminder that even back then, people loved to improvise. What I found particularly striking was how this accidental discovery set the stage for a tug-of-war between European powers. The French entry in 1555 is a story in itself. Imagine Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon, bold and calculating, attempting to carve out France Antarctique. He wasn't just looking for land. He envisioned a utopian colony, a rare mix of Protestant and Catholic settlers living harmoniously. At least, that was the idea. Spoiler, harmony wasn't exactly what unfolded. But here's the real kicker. Rio wasn't just a battleground for European powers. The indigenous Tupinamba played a central role, navigating alliances and rivalries with these strange newcomers. They weren't passive observers, but active participants in this unfolding drama, shaping the fate of the land they called home for centuries. And we've only scratched the surface. By 1567, the clash between the French and Portuguese reaches a boiling point, and Rio's future hangs in the balance. Who will triumph? And how will these conflicts lay the foundation for the Rio we know today? The next chapter promises even more intrigue, alliances, and outright battles. I, for one, can't wait to see how this story unfolds.
On November 1555, French ships, their sails billowing in the Atlantic wind, anchor in Guanabara Bay. Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon steps onto Brazilian soil, claiming it as France Antarctique. The Tupinamba, eager for new allies against the Portuguese, welcome the French. Together, they construct a fortress on Sergipe Island. This bold move threatens Portuguese dominance and plants the seeds of a fierce struggle. For the French, this is a chance to carve a foothold in the New World, while for the Tupinamba, it offers hope for reclaiming their land. The tropical beauty of the bay hides the brewing storm of conflict as two empires and an ancient people clash over the fate of Rio de Janeiro. Is 1560. The air is heavy with anticipation as Portuguese warships commanded by Mem de Sa approach Guanabara Bay. Their cannons roar, sending shockwaves through the French fortress on Sergipe Island. The Tupinamba and French forces fight valiantly, but the Portuguese assault is relentless. Fire and smoke engulf the island as the fortress crumbles. The clash is brutal, a violent display of imperial ambition. Despite their victory, the Portuguese failed to completely expel the French, leaving the conflict unresolved. The bay becomes a war zone, its tranquil beauty overshadowed by the chaos of conquest. By March 1565, Estácio de Sá, nephew of Mem de Sá, arrives at Guanabara Bay with soldiers and settlers. He selects a strategic location between Sugarloaf Mountain and the bay's mouth to establish São Sebastião do Rio de Janeiro. The settlement is named in honor of Saint Sebastian, the patron saint of Portugal's King Sebastian. Wooden palisades rise as settlers work tirelessly to build a defensive stronghold against French and Tupinamba attacks. Estácio de Sá dreams of a thriving city, a beacon of Portuguese power. The struggle is far from over, but the foundation of Rio de Janeiro marks a turning point in the battle for the bay. The final battle for Guanabara Bay erupts as Portuguese forces in January of 1567, led by Mem de Sá and his nephew Estácio de Sá, clash with French troops and their Tupinamba allies. The air fills with the roar of cannons and the cries of warriors. Estácio de Sá, a symbol of Portuguese resilience, falls in battle, mortally wounded by a Tupinamba arrow. Despite his sacrifice, the Portuguese emerge victorious, driving the French from the bay. This victory cements Portugal's dominance in the region, paving the way for the growth of Rio de Janeiro. The triumph is bittersweet, as the land bears the scars of conflict and the memory of its fallen hero. By 1575, with the French threat eliminated, the Portuguese turn their focus to expanding Rio de Janeiro. Settlers clear the land, planting sugarcane and building fortified homes along the bay. African slaves, brought by Portuguese ships, labor in the fields, shaping the colony's economy. Military forts rise, standing as symbols of the Crown's commitment to securing the region. The bustling port sees ships arriving with goods, people, and ambitions. The foundation of a thriving city begins to take shape, though its growth comes at the cost of indigenous lives and enslaved labor. The land's beauty contrasts with the harsh realities of colonial enterprise. In 1580, the Iberian Union merges the Spanish and Portuguese empires under one crown, altering the course of colonial governance. In Rio de Janeiro, the shift brings both opportunities and tensions. Spanish influence increases, with new directives to fortify the city and boost trade with neighboring colonies. Merchants thrive, but settlers grow wary of foreign oversight. The bay becomes a hub of maritime activity, with ships carrying gold, sugar, and slaves. Amid the prosperity, indigenous resistance persists in the jungle, a reminder of the land's contested nature. The waters of Guanabara Bay are disturbed by the sudden arrival of French privateer ships in 1594. Under the cover of darkness, they launch a swift and brutal raid on Portuguese trading vessels docked at Rio de Janeiro. Cannons light up the night as settlers scramble to defend their port. The privateers loot and destroy, seeking revenge for past defeats. Though the Portuguese repel the attack, the raid exposes the vulnerability of their defenses. The city must strengthen its fortifications, as the threat of foreign aggression remains ever present on Brazil's shores. By 1600, the dawn of a new century sees Rio de Janeiro transformed. The city's wooden palisades have given way to stone walls, its streets bustling with activity. Portuguese settlers, African slaves, and indigenous workers toil together in the fields and markets, creating a patchwork of cultures under the shadow of colonial rule. Guanabara Bay thrives as a center of trade, with sugar, gold, and other goods flowing to Europe. Yet, the scars of conflict linger. Indigenous resistance continues in the jungle, a quiet but persistent reminder of the land's contested history. Rio's future gleams with promise, even as it remains tethered to its tumultuous past.
We've just seen the dramatic events that shaped the history of Rio de Janeiro, starting with the Portuguese arriving in 1502, mistakenly calling the bay a river, and the French arriving in 1555 to establish their colony, France Antarctique. The audacity of the French trying to settle in Portuguese territory was, at the very least, bold. But what stood out to me was how the Tupinamba navigated these new and conflicting alliances. The French thought they could forge strong ties with the indigenous people, but it wasn't a simple friendship. There were complex layers of mutual need, distrust, and, at times, betrayal. Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon, the French leader, wasn't the most charismatic, but he had a strategic mind. His attempts to create harmony within his colony failed, especially with the Huguenots and the indigenous groups. Meanwhile, the Portuguese faced an unforeseen challenge. The French were establishing themselves right in their backyard. Imagine their frustration when they realized what was happening in Guanabara Bay. Now, as we close this chapter, we can't help but wonder, how did the Portuguese manage to retake the bay? And what role did the Church play in this complex battle between empires? The first part of the story ended around 1600, but the drama is far from over. From 1600 to 1700, the battle for Rio de Janeiro continues, with alliances constantly shifting, an increasing Portuguese presence, and the growing involvement of the Catholic Church. The question remains: what happens next as Portugal strengthens its hold over Brazil? Stay tuned, because the twists and turns of colonization are just beginning.